Pioneers in any field of research find it difficult to maintain moderate attitudes. Pressed on by an understandable enthusiasm, the exponents of a new system are likely to exaggerate its importance and assume that it is a sovereign remedy for all ills, or an infallible solution to all problems. To a marked degree, this phenomenon has been noticeable in the rise of psychology. The findings of Freud were first accepted as infallible revelations, and the techniques which he advanced were faithfully applied to every conceivable situation, with little regard for the individuality of the patient. In advancing the scientific aspects of analytical procedures, the philosophical and religious equations were often neglected or passed over as aberrational factors. On the assumption that man must be rescued from what was termed a sickly mysticism and restored to a healthy and robust materialism, psychologists moved rapidly from diagnosis and therapy to almost fanatical indoctrination. By so doing, they closed their minds to many phases of human character and offended numerous sincere persons. The proper end of psychotherapy is the establishment or restoration of normalcy. It is obvious, therefore, that there must be some concept of that which is normal, suitable, and necessary to the proper function of man. How is such a standard to be established? Shall the person be considered normal because he conforms with prevailing attitude? Is he well adjusted when he thinks, feels, and acts according to the fashions of his time? Are his pressures and his intensities sublimated when he is convinced that he is the inevitable product of heredity and environment? Are the idealistic overtones which have sustained him through long ages of confusion and discord merely superstitions and delusions from which he must be rescued for his own good? To answer such questions, the total nature of man must be completely explored by competent investigators concerned primarily with the discovery of facts and not the preservation of opinions. Prejudicial opinions are difficult to justify on a level of research devoted primarily to the mind and its processes. It is obvious, of course, that mind must explore mind. The weakest link in any line of study is the student himself. The subject may be infinite, but those pursuing it are finite, and can interpret their findings only in terms of their own understanding. The first modern psychologists were scientifically trained men, strongly influenced by prevailing attitudes of 19th-century scholarship. They could proceed only on familiar levels, overshadowed by the contributions of Darwin and Huxley. There was a general revolt against the Scottish metaphysicians who had long dominated higher education. The Superman of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer was an intellectual biological giant errated according to a formula and predestined to rule the world. He was a completely obvious creation inhabiting an entirely objective sphere. The prospect was inspiring to those who accepted it, but disconcerting to the average person who had long held the devout belief in a nobler destiny for the species. 241 SE chords. Gradually, the first exuberance subsided and psychologists began to recognize that there was more to man's internal life than Freud had discovered. With due gratitude to the great pioneer, but with firm resolve to permit the natural growth of the subject, Adler and Jung broadened the foundations of psychological method. To a degree at least, progress was impelled by the personal needs of those seeking analytical assistance. Even the humblest of mortals has a will and mind of his own, and in a democratic world, self-expression cannot be permanently denied. By degrees, the value of religion, ethics, and morality has come to be widely recognized. The mechanistic concept of life has been invalidated by experience, and even its ablest supporters have been forced to modify their conclusions. A notable example of this trend is the revival of the humanities and the immediate concern about culture. Even more significant is the phenomenal growth of religious institutions and the public recognition that science without integrity threatens disaster. Today, those seeking counseling are no longer merely worshippers ready to accept anything without doubt or question. They have become mindful of the psychologist himself, and realize that they must suffer from his deficiencies. They dare to ask if he is a well-adjusted person and, after a few conferences, decide this matter for themselves. Nor are they willing to accept recommendations and suggestions which violate their own standards of integrity or conflict with values which they internally recognize as eternally true. It is observable that among the outstanding psychologists today are men with ideals, deep convictions, and sincere appreciation for religious principles. Scholarship has also broadened, and a basic knowledge of comparative religion, historical cultures, philosophical systems, symbolism, art, music, and literature is a prerequisite for the adequate counselor. It has seemed wise indeed to gather up the fragments of rejected ideas, re-evaluate them, and restore them to their proper places within the structure of mental science. The patient under analysis is beginning to learn that his integration moves most rapidly and successfully in the direction of his own highest convictions. Several recent discussions with counselors and those under analysis have brought out interesting points. A psychologist told me that one of his patients believed in rebirth, and 20 years ago this would have been considered part of his ailment. Today, however, the counselor admitted that the man's conviction had become a positive factor in his recovery. In another case, a patient, who had long been a student of Oriental philosophy, progressed more rapidly because his integration was hastened by a larger understanding of the nature and substance of mind as taught in these Eastern schools. Even though the psychologist involved was not sympathetic, the patient discovered that he was able to defend and sustain his philosophical ideals and at the same time win the respect of the counselor and make a constructive contribution to the program of analysis. Man possesses within himself internal faculties of cognition and is capable of an apperceptive grasp of fact and reality, and we should realize that most knowledge about man has come from or through man himself. For thousands of years, the human being has sought to understand his own internal nature, especially that part which has come to be called the soul or psyche. There is a vast religious and philosophical literature bearing on this mystery, but many psychologists have not taken the trouble to explore this field. Point 2. 855 It would seem that psychology cannot accomplish the greatest good for all concerned until it clarifies its position regarding the intrinsic structure and function of the psychic principle. It may be well enough to call the soul the seat of life or the source of vitality or, again, the cause of man's mental and emotional activity, but actually, such statements tell us very little. Nor are we in a position to demonstrate conclusively that the functions of the soul are merely byproducts of heredity and environment. It is quite possible that the soul is a thing in itself, having its own particular capacities and qualities as well as the ability of exercising a peculiar power far more significant than mere animation or the sustaining of the thought-emotion faculties. The scientists of the ancient world, and they were men of considerable attainment, drew heavily upon the law of analogy in the organizing of their ideas. They bound universal nature and human nature together, seeking to explain one in the terms of other. They postulated a world soul and a human soul, and considered it proper and necessary to build all particular sciences upon the contemplation of universal processes. The solar system was a body, the visible form of a blessed God, and, like all other natural bodies, it could be observed and examined. They developed astronomy as a system of sidereal physiology, and upon its principles they fashioned a more subtle science. They called this astrology and regarded it as universal psychology. If any of their conclusions were valid, they advanced the study of the soul both human and die far beyond the attainments of modern psychologists. It may be useful, therefore, to survey these older findings as they apply to the concepts of today. As psychology extends its examination of intangible structures, it is becoming more inclined to recognize that the psyche, or psychic entity, in man, is a kind of invisible person, having functions and qualities peculiar to itself, and inhabiting a subtle body of its own. This body is not merely an area, field, or zone, but a highly organized structure overshadowing or interpenetrating the physical body. Thus we have the concept of a person in a body, with the immediate implication that this person one's superior to the body and is the cause of bodily activity. It has been taken for granted that the physical form is the house of this psychic being, but we are no longer certain that the soul cannot have an existence apart from the body, or that the processes which created the body have created the soul, or that the soul is substantially the byproduct of bodily function. The conviction that the soul is a being subsisting in its own nature has long been held by the wisest and noblest of mortals. The East Indians, Egyptians, and Greeks were among the most enlightened of ancient peoples, and their contributions to modern knowledge are real and undeniable. They held the soul to be an entity neither human nor divine but occupying a place between these two extremes. Thus it served as a bridge between them and made possible the intellectual and moral life of the human being. They further affirmed that the substance of the soul was different from both spirit and matter, or was perhaps a subtle compound of spiritual and material elements. Thus it possessed a body superphysical but not supernatural. While such traditional beliefs have not been demonstrated to the satisfaction of modern scientists, it is only fair to say that they have not been disproved, in the modern tendency in the fiqh is to sustain many of the earlier endings and to suspect that even more of the older doctrines will be justified. If the psychic nature is embodied in a peculiar vehicle of its own, the material constituting that vehicle must be derived from some natural source, and it was anciently taught that the psyche existed in a region known as the world soul, or the soul body of divinity. If this be true, an analogy can be established. The physical body of man is part of the physical structure of nature. It is derived from elements and is nourished by energies. It is subject to the laws and rules of the sphere to which it belongs, and can have no factual existence apart from material substances. If the soul is also an integrated organism, it must likewise be nourished and sustained by psychic elements and be under the dominion of the laws and rules of the sphere of which it is a part. It must therefore abide in the kind of place natural and proper to it, with its own requirements and obligations. Although it may communicate its will and purpose to the body, it may well have will and purpose apart from body, with its own inevitable destiny and the means suitable to attain that destiny. We have long assumed that the soul is conditioned only by the body. Thus, man, through his objective activities can make his soul sick, and once the psychic nature is deformed or diseased, it can in turn react upon the body, causing distress and interfering with normal functions. By this thinking, also, the soul is the product of heredity, or at least is largely a victim of hereditary tendencies. Such opinions have destroyed the essential dignity of the soul itself, placing it under the tyranny of the body and subjecting it totally to the laws of physical existence. While it is possible to demonstrate that such a condition usually exists, it is not possible to prove that it is normal or proper. It could well be that an abnormal state has been accepted as normal. Because the soul is discovered to be enslaved, it is assumed that slavery is normal and intended. All religions stand firmly against this conclusion, for they insist that the body should be the servant of the soul and that the superior part of man should control and direct his conduct, and not be merely a victim thereof. Socrates pointed out that unregenerate man, one ignorant of his own constitution, so perverted the resources of the soul that he fell victim to excessive attitudes and as a consequence lived a confused and uncertain life. Through the temperance of the body, and the cultivation of the mind and emotions, it was possible to liberate the soul and restore its leadership over the affairs of living. Such regeneration is the proper end of religion and philosophy, and the true purpose of science. By this thinking, it would be possible for the soul to have inclinations contrary to those of the body, and conflict could arise from man's unwillingness to follow the directives of his own psyche. To clarify this point, it would first be necessary to reverse the present attitude. If we assume, as we reasonably must, that the subconscious life of man is heavily burdened with the consequences of his objective intemperances, this condition must be corrected before the psychic life can be properly analyzed or examined. We have already learned that the soul is a far more complicated instrument than the body, and that it has a natural inclination to reveal itself through the body and to instruct the body mentally and emotionally through archetypal dreams, visions, and extrasensory experiences. We must yet, however, escape from the belief that the total content of the soul is derived from physical sources, hereditary, traditional, or environmental. As long as the psychic nature must express itself through the conditioned objective personality, its intrinsic constitution will be difficult to determine. This does not mean, however, that the psyche is identical with the temperament which serves as a channel for its expression. We are not yet certain as to what kind of substance composes the psychic body of the human being. We do not know whether there are psychic atoms equivalent to physical atoms. Plato, following the wisdom of the Egyptians, declared the soul to be a mathematical formula which could be represented by an eight-faced symmetrical solid. In recent times, the soul has been variously diagrammed, but no implication has been made that such diagrammatic forms have more than symbolic meaning. Man's physical experience, however, inclines him to further analogical speculation. The physical body is a compound structure with proper shape and boundary, and, as Leonardo da Vinci pointed out, it is built upon mathematical and geometrical laws. There is nothing unreasonable, therefore, in assuming that a being of any kind capable of influencing other beings must have a structure of its own by which its separateness or individuality is maintained. The work of Einstein has demonstrated that it is possible by mathematical procedure to establish the reality of invisible facts, and similar procedures could be, and ultimately will be, applied to the examination of the psyche. Man is an individual, and the psychic life which sustains him sustains this individuality. The soul is not merely a generality mingling subjectively with all other souls in a common diffusion. It holds within itself not only mass pressures, but individual pressures. It preserves memory, but it is primarily the memory of the person. There is evidence that there are other than personal memories in the soul, but this field also needs further exploration. Psychological techniques demonstrate that the psychic field is susceptible to damage, capable of repair, and can be redirected, reintegrated and reorganized. It is further capable of being conditioned through effort, through religious and philosophical disciplines, and through scientific procedure. It responds to counseling and analysis, and changes wrought in it have varying degrees of permanence. There is also evidence that the psychic field is subject to habitual processes, both natural and acquired, and it reacts according to a broad pattern of probabilities and expectancies. Is it so difficult, then, to recognize it as an organized being and not merely a nebulous haze? When we work with the soul, we find that it can be molded as a sculptor molds clay. If it is not something in itself, how can it be changed, improved, or modified? For that matter, how can it sicken or be subject to clearly definable and diagnosable ailments? If the soul is a psychic being inhabiting a psychic sphere which is the proper residence of all souls, then it receives from this field its proper structure and form, which, though invisible, is real and substantial. It therefore must be examined by sciences equivalent to anatomy, physiology, and biology. This is especially true if we believe that the soul, to a degree at least, contributes to those phases of physical life which have anatomical, physiological, and biological significance. Philosophy has pointed out that things themselves superior cannot be ruled by inferiors insofar as natural processes are concerned. If, then, the soul participates largely in the administration of the body, it must be superior to the body and must lack nothing which is obvious or factual in the body. It cannot therefore be deficient in the principle of form, for if it were, the body itself would inevitably reflect that deficiency. By degrees, man will become conscious of the natural proportions of the psychic self and his own association therewith, and he may ultimately recognize the soul as the source of that individuality which he now identifies with his material nature. In the physical world, two factors appear to strongly affect the individual. Man is moved by conditions existing within his own nature, and he is further moved by common conditions outside of himself. Conditions which move him from within are usually ascribed to heredity or assumed to have their origin in some inherited tendency. The source of such inheritance is not entirely clear, but a moral problem arises if we assume that man is the product of forces beyond his control. There is an increasing suspicion that in some mysterious way man inherits from himself, rather than from remote forebears of dubious attainments. The second modifying circumstance is the pressure of environmental conditions. Physically speaking, environment divides into several levels. We cannot simply say that personal problems are due to environment and consider that anything is solved. Environment, for example, can include the disposition of the person, which, emanating from him, modifies the conditions of his living. The individual with an unpleasant disposition will create for himself a series of external situations which can become difficult or tragic. There is also an environment which arises from natural temperament, by which the individual is drawn into situations consistent with his inclinations or, by selectivity, recognizes and adapts only certain phases of environmental opportunities. He thus becomes acutely aware of some things and remains totally indifferent to other equally valid things. This situation is present wherever intense interests exist. The individual who has devoted his life to a restricted group of activities develops extreme sensitivity in his chosen fields, but remains comparatively untouched by experiences not related thereto. Environment also involves social levels. Thus the world we live in may be modified by religious family background, racial differentiation, and such physical circumstances as location. We must also consider the climatic zones, the quality of soil, and the surrounding flora and fauna. We note that nearly all advanced civilizations have developed in temperate zones and that human temperament reacts strongly to the changes of the seasons, the phases of the moon, and the passing incidents of weather. In his work on adolescence, Dr. G. Stanley Hall, discussing the soul, writes, "It is not a fixed, abiding thing, but grew out of antecedent soul states as different from its present forms as protoplasm is from a mature body. Every element has shaped and tempered it. Its long experience with light and darkness, day and night, has fashioned its rhythm indelibly. Heat and cold, the flickering of flame, smoke, and ashes, have oriented it toward both thermal extremes. Cloud forms have almost created the imagination. Water and a long apprenticeship to aquatic and arboreal life have left as plain and indelible marks upon the soul as upon the body. Sky, stars, wind, storms, fetishism, flowers, animals, ancient battles, industries, occupations, and worship have polarized the soul to fear and affection, and created anger and pity. If the psyche is thus susceptible to a lengthy educational process, and retains within itself such a diversity of experience phenomena, there is all the more reason to assume that it must possess a constitution endowed with retentive powers and capable of the rationalization and organization of incidents and circumstances. If it can grow, unfold, and expand, it must have the nature by which the process of its becoming is lawful and in accordance with the natural laws governing such procedure. Dr. Stanley Hall's remarks would go so far as to imply that the soul is the principal source of man's mortal reflections and that it is the growth of the soul, and not that of the body alone, which promises maturity. In addition to the specialized kinds of environment already mentioned, man, collectively and individually, is subject to the vast electrophysical environment of an astronomical universe. He is part of a creation influenced by the precession of the equinoxes, the revolutions of planets, and the rotation of the Earth. These phenomena may influence him directly or indirectly. Direct influence is that which affects the actual constitution of his body or modifies the inclinations and intensities of his thoughts and emotions. Indirectly, man is affected because of the environmental factors of astrometeorology. Who shall say that he escapes floods, droughts, unseasonal storms, tempests, earthquakes, tidal waves, and the modifications affecting the heaviside layer of the Earth's atmosphere? In recent years, there has been talk of cosmic rays, and we observe the effects of sunspots on tree rings and the fur of rabbits. While the average person considers insufficient rainfall to be merely an economic problem affecting the cost of produce, to the farmer it is a moral or psychological crisis with reaction upon his temperament and his total way of life. An outstanding example is the smog situation now affecting many large communities, and this causes anxiety, irritation, exaggerates respiratory ailments, and has in turn led to strong emotional and mental reactions. Man lives within a world of constant mutations. He may, to a degree, modify nature by skill and ingenuity, but the planet, moving in its endless course around the sun, is still his home, and he must cope with the inevitable emergencies which arise. If the ancients were correct, the solar system also has its psychic life. Each of the planets is ensouled, and the various motions and relationships of sidereal bodies involve not only physical but psychic energies. Thus we might say that the soul exists within a psychic universe and is susceptible to the influences existing there. If it has an integrated body derived from some level of energy substance, then that body also has its inevitable environment consisting of the total field of energy from which it is derived. It would follow that a proper adjustment between the psychic entity and its plane or field is just as important as the physical adjustment of man to the world in which he lives. The mortal body can be drowned in water, a material element. It can be consumed by fire, also a material element. Thus bodies may be destroyed by the very elements of which they are composed, if placed in detrimental relationship to these elements. Are we not justified, then, in attempting to study the psychic structure of man in terms of its own environment, rather than merely in reference to its physical associations? When we try to understand why man exists as we know him, we must accept the concepts of time and place adjustment. He is involved in the universal machinery of existence. He lives in a certain kind of universe and within a particular solar system of that universe. He inhabits a planet belonging to that solar system, and he has made his home in a certain region upon that planet. It would be unwise to say that if he lived in another world or on another planet his growth would have followed the familiar pattern which he knows. If he lived in some other place, at some other time, he would certainly be a different creature. This would not mean, however, that he would necessarily be more or less than he is now. The point is that it is impossible to deny rationally that the universe affects man. Once this point is clear, the details must be solved by experience, examination, and reflection. Even within the smaller experience of Earth living, we recognize that environmental patterns are forever changing, so that particular experiences are captured within cycles of time. A generation brought up on television, flying saucers, and science fiction will not have the same psychological integration as some earlier generation in which such concerns were not even contemplated. Motion pictures, the automobile, and the airplane affect man not merely in terms of convenience and inconvenience, but in terms of morality and ethics. They condition the human being, and every physical contribution to a man's way of life produces a psychological reaction within that man, changing him, affecting his family life, his business associations, his hopes, his fears, his convictions, his beliefs, in fact, everything that has to do with his objective existence. Thus, time placement becomes a key to the degree of integration he is likely to attain. We often speak nostalgically about the good old times or look forward with optimism to the better times that lie ahead. Actually, of course, we could not live successfully in the past, nor can we adjust ourselves adequately to a remote futurity. The motion in time causes what we call social change. This is a wonderful term used to explain what we consider the evolution of society. It is a rather complicated situation. Why are generations different? The answer is, they live in different times. Why are times different? Obviously, because different generations live in them. Actually, cyclic motion lies behind all these changes. It is orderly and consistent. It moves things along well-established roads, building upon old foundations and revealing vast cyclic laws forever operating. The old astrologers, particularly Ptolemy of Alexandria, assumed that the tides moving in the souls of men followed the motions of heaven, even as the tides in the ocean obey the moon. These old stargazers divided planetary motion into two classifications. In their astrological science, they distinguished major and minor planets. For them, the major planets were those whose motion appeared to be slow, ponderous, and heavy. They referred particularly to Jupiter and Saturn, but after the discovery of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, these have also been included in the major grouping. Neptune, for example, remains within one sign of the zodiac for 12 or 13 years, and Uranus for approximately 8 years. The minor planets make their circumambulations around the Sun in a much shorter time, and the Moon, a luminary and not a planet, circles the Earth in approximately 28 days. During all their motions, these bodies constantly assume patterned relationships, constituting what the ancients called the handwriting on the wall of heaven. The astronomer Kepler made a careful study of tile relationships or aspects between planets and other heavenly bodies, and was convinced that these aspects had a prodigious influence upon both the material and psychic life of nature and man. Consider for a moment the motion of a major planet, like Neptune. In terms of astrology, all persons born within a certain period of 12 years will have this planet in the same sign. This means that a vast body of human beings must have this placement, and will therefore share together some special effect or mass conditioning. For example, Neptune entered the sign of Virgo in 1929. The ancients said that Virgo governed labor and employment. Neptune is usually read as a malefic planet because man is not yet able to adjust to its benefic implications. The following 12 years were those of the Great Depression, and we must admit that this difficult span of time affected not only the economic status of people, but wrought numerous and sometimes disastrous psychological changes. It will be a long time before the effects of the Great Depression will be completely neutralized. Of course, much depends upon whether we accept the validity of planetary influence. Before rejecting it, however, we should find a better explanation, and this is not easy. The study of planetary cycles inclines to the suspicion that there are two distinct patterns operating in nature: one moving in terms of generations, producing lasting psychological effects, the other moving in terms of days or months, and representing inconstant or transitory situations. The long cycles are reflected in wars, depressions, and the rise and fall of nations. The short cycles, with more immediate and impermanent influence, are obvious in the moods of persons, deviations in climate, sudden crises in personal or collective affairs. Both these cycles affect the individual, not only externally, but internally, not only his environment, but that internal nature which in turn reacts upon his outward activities. Early astrologers pointed out that the so-called benefic and malefic effects of planets should not be interpreted as meaning that the heavenly bodies actually exercise a moral force for good or evil. Therefore it should not be assumed that planetary rays or aspects cause a person to be good, impel him to evil, contribute to his happiness, or bestow misery. Sidereal energy is factual, that is, it has an inevitable quality to which all creatures react according to their own endowments and dispositions. The modifications resulting from the operations of natural law are immutable, and require perpetual adjustment between the individual and his environment. Changing circumstances invite thoughtful persons to self-improvement through the release of internal capacities and abilities. What we term an unfortunate situation is usually one which we have been unwilling or unable to meet with sufficient insight, understanding, or courage. Failure to adjust may result in a long sequence of difficulties which we are to blame upon others. It is the tendency of all persons to react to pressure according to their own intrinsic characteristics. When a problem arises, therefore, the aggressive individual meets it aggressively, the passive person passively, the worrier with trepidation, and the fearful with anxiety. Thus the pressure of conditions can only invite the individual to reveal himself. Situations naturally lead to consequences, but these also are the results of the individual being himself at all times. He is forever accepting or rejecting the pressures of opportunity. Unless he changes his ways, circumstances cannot change. Because they are not moral entities but amoral forces which must be met by personal morality and interpreted accordingly. We may say that the inevitable motion of space is divine because it is inevitable, and that it is good because it is capable of stimulating or releasing good from all those who possess it in themselves. If the individual, however, is incapable of accepting universal good, because it comes into conflict with his own ignorance, then what appears to be tragedy may result. Modern man is taught that physical survival requires an intimate cooperation between man and his material environment, particularly his universal environment. Man must learn the laws governing himself and his kind and must obey these laws. His psychological health may depend in part upon obedience to the rules of mortal living, but it is more than possible that the psychic life of man is also under rules and regulations, and these likewise must be kept if security wants to be experienced. Psychic laws bear upon the relationship between the psychic nature and its sphere of influence. As early as the 16th century, Paracelsus von Hohenheim, the great Swiss physician and astronomer mystic, declared that the psychic life of man was governed by psychic energy deriving its authority from the same universe which is the source of physical energy. The understanding of the psychic radiations planetary, solar, universal, and cosmic is essential to an adequate knowledge of the internal life of the individual. The soul is subject to rhythm patterns and motions not directly traceable either to the physical organism or to hereditary background. Furthermore, the intuitive and apperceptive faculties do not fashion the soul, but are expressions of its own intrinsic essence or substance. In other words, the soul is not only moved by itself and by the body, but it is also subject to emotion imparted to it by the sphere to which it belongs. It exists in a field of energy by which it is perpetually modified and its attributes are continually conditioned. It seems that the psychic life of man is subject to mass motion. We know, for example, that psychological ailments have greatly increased. Our first thought would lie that they have been intensified by the physical pressures of society. It could also be assumed that the internal life of man is becoming more intensive and requires stronger support on the level of social relationships. But it is also true that the average person does not control his physical relationships with living, his intellectual relationships with himself and others, or his spiritual relationships with God and nature. He does not consciously experience the power to direct his own psychic field any more adequately than he can control his appetites or emotions, or go contrary to his momentary desires. He has seen the pitiful consequences of accidents on the public highways, yet he continues to drive his car at unreasonable speeds simply because it pleases him to do as he likes. If he has not corrected such obvious character defects, and has neither the will nor inclination to overcome them, how can we assume that he controls his psychic destiny? If he does not keep the laws where lawfulness is obviously necessary, how can he keep universal rules which he does not fully understand and may not even believe to exist? Man has gradually learned to dominate certain aspects of physical nature. He has accomplished this by a magnificent but largely selfish program. Unfortunately, however, he has made no comparable effort on more subtle levels, and does little to coordinate his psychological, mystical, spiritual, and philosophical resources. He permits these overtones to develop as best they can, assuming that experience alone error will ultimately mature him, or that evolution will carry him along the road of progress with little, if any, positive contributions of his own. Meaning trial and psychologically, man must either learn to govern his own psychic field or else this field will operate in its own way and he must abide by the consequences. There is much in favor of the soul's leadership, but only after it has been cleared of the negative burden which has been imposed upon it by the mind and emotions. There are many sincere persons who are convinced that the best form of medication for body or soul is proper nutrition. Here, again, we may give thought to the findings of Paracelsus. He believed that all physical nutrition resulted from magnetic poles which were strengthened in the body by food. In other words, the basic elements within the food products were not in themselves nourishing, but acted as catalyzing agents. They drew energy from space and made it available for the preservation of the body. He described medicinal herbs as stars scattered upon the earth, for each of them captured and held the rays of the heavenly bodies. These medicaments, when gathered at proper times, had peculiar virtues and could assist in the restoring of health. Perhaps in some way the opinions of Paracelsus have descended to us in the theory of vitamins. As all things must be nourished in order that they may live. Philosophy sought some way to feed the soul. The most enlightened Greeks taught that beauty was psychic nutrition. This may be allegorical, but it suggests that the soul has its appetitive needs. Although these are not the same as those of the body, they are nevertheless real and urgent, and if the soul is to be strong, it must be sustained by what we call the virtues. It thrives upon friendship and mutual regard. It is nourished by wisdom, love, and understanding. It is kept healthy by an enlightened moral code, and it develops few ailments among those who admire the beautiful, serve the good, cultivate natural graces, and keep the faith. When it is subjected to malnutrition or a faulty diet, it can sicken and be afflicted by the psychic equivalents of those physical defects and diseases from which men suffer. Because the soul has a body, though unseen, and exists in a world invisible to mortal eyes, its requirements must be properly considered. It must be maintained in proper adjustment to its natural sphere, and be supported as far as possible by the physical resources of the person. Paracelsus taught, and others more recently have begun to suspect, that the key to the understanding of the soul lies in the psychological use of astronomy. Paracelsus declared that man derived his spirit from the stars, his soul from the planets, and his body from the elements. The sun is a star, and the medieval mystics regarded it as a source of life essentially spiritual. By this life, all creatures are sustained and nourished, both inwardly and outwardly, directly and indirectly. As there is a stellar world in space, so there is a stellar world in man, who is a little constellation sharing in the total life of his universal environment. When Paracelsus likened the soul to a planet moving majestically around the sovereign sun, he established a thought-provoking analogy. The planets reflect the light of the solar orb and fuse it throughout the mundane world. Plato recognized the soul as an eightfold creature consisting of 7 superphysical qualities and the physical power of generation. As the life-light of the sun is differentiated and distributed by the planets, so the spirit, the sun in man, manifests its radiant energy through the psychic vortices which are the spirit before its throne. The soul, substantiated by the spirit, diffuses its 8 powers through the body, and these are released into manifestation in the corporeal world as mental and emotional capacities or attributes. Religion recognized the 7 superphysical powers of the soul under the symbolism of the 7 cardinal virtues, and the perversions of these powers, through ignorance.